This is a summary of the 5th article in Mobile Moxie's Entity and Language series called Query Language, Phone Language, and Physical Location, the difference between personalization and localization, at least in Google's eyes. In this article, we talk about how Google seems to be moving towards what we call entity-first indexing. So we've kind of renamed mobile-first indexing to be entity-first indexing, because our theory is that the new method of indexing is based more on the knowledge graph than anything else. And knowledge graph is made up of entities. We believe that Google wishes to build out the knowledge graph in all languages because it will help them interact through the Google Assistant with more people in more languages around the world if knowledge graph information is available in every language. So the idea here is that it may be hard for Google to crawl and scrape to find knowledge about all the different entities in the world and have it in every language. But if they organize the knowledge graph around numeric entity IDs, which they do, then they have a kind of language agnostic map of the relationships of things in the world. And remember, entities are concepts that are universal. So the idea of mother is the same, regardless of what language you say it in or what keyword you use to describe it. A mother is still usually has a daughter or a son and is maternal, has certain characteristics that apply in all cases. Similarly, books and movies are entities that may be translated but exist as an entity regardless of what language they're in. So the idea here is Google can do a better job of using the knowledge graph to answer voice queries when it's language agnostic. So this article focuses on the way that knowledge graph interacts with different languages. It builds on the previous articles in the series, but what it does is proves out the idea that the phone operating system and particular personalized language settings on a phone can impact the knowledge graph results in a search query. And what's interesting here is that they impact the knowledge graph result without impacting the rest of the organic blue link search results. So knowledge graph and organic results can be in different languages, especially if the phone language doesn't match the language of the query. And we think this is because Google is trying much harder for their own hosted position 0 content to be in the right language, because if it's in the wrong language, and it's surfaced as a voice result, which knowledge graph often is, then the user won't have a good recourse or won't be able to find the information that they're looking for and won't even really know how to respond if it doesn't speak the language that the query is spoken in or the knowledge graph result is spoken in. So Google's trying harder to detect what language should be in the knowledge graph and some other knowledge graph related position 0 results. So what we saw in our testing is that different settings impact the knowledge graph depending on the search scenario and to some degree the operating system of the phone that you're searching on. And these can change the experience. Now, the article isn't suggesting that as SEOs we should somehow be optimizing for the different languages of knowledge graph necessarily, because what we found is that Google is translating the knowledge graph in all cases, even for languages that aren't part of the Cloud Natural Language API, which is fascinating. So they're translating it in all cases based on the settings. Now, what is also true is they're not translating the organic results. They're paying much less attention to this kind of personalization or this kind of localization in the regular organic results. There is some change, but it's not huge. So as SEOs, the important takeaway from this article is that we need to think about knowledge graph display settings as having different influences than regular organic search rankings. So our best prioritization of what language settings impact the language that the knowledge graph will return in start with the search settings. So what you would set in Google from the browser as your search language preference. But if that's not set, which often it's not, the next most important one on both Android and iOS appears to be the phone language. So within your operating system on your phone, what language did you choose? If that's not available, for instance, in an incognito search, then Google might revert to a Google account language setting. What we found is not impacting the knowledge graph, because those are all for knowledge graph translation. What's not impacting the knowledge graph is the language of the query, any kind of iCloud language settings, or the physical location. Now, this is different for regular organic blue link style results. In organic, the search language setting is still the most important, but after that, the query language and then the ccTLD and physical location and Google account. Those last three are it's hard to tell. They don't have as strong of an impact as just the query language and the search settings, but they do probably have some impact. But like I said, the important thing is to know that these are handled separately, or at least the language aspect of what shows is handled separately. So Google ccTLD, physical location, query language really don't impact the language of the knowledge graph, but they may impact organic results. The other thing that's important to understand here is that this is interesting, but what's the bigger idea is that this may just be the beginning of Google using live cloud translation to provide good results, especially if they help Google provide a better knowledge graph or voice-oriented result. So what we could start to see is if you have information that is being scraped from your site into the knowledge graph, and historically you've been there for a while, but there might be better information that Google can scrape from another site that's in a different language that translates better than yours, then Google could start to prefer other resources. So the idea there is there's more competition because it's not just you're competing with content that's written in your own language, but you're competing with content that's written potentially in any language. And if your content doesn't translate well into other languages, then Google may prefer other assets to scrape and put into the knowledge graph or things like that. The other thing is that this may not always be limited to the knowledge graph. Google may start to use this translation feature in other things. And like I said, we're seeing it in knowledge graph and knowledge graph related things like book carousels and movie carousels that stem from the knowledge graph. But they're not using it in all of the Google hosted position zero assets, although they are using it in a lot of them. And especially the tabs and stuff like that as you move around, and anything that's a Google hosted position zero asset does seem to be translated to based on the rules that we established in this article. So please look at the article. There are a lot of great images. If you're just scanning, look at the images and the diagrams. There's a lot of great stuff there. And this has been a summary of the 5th article and last article in the Entity and Language series, Query Language, Phone Language, and Physical Location, how Google differentiates between personalization and localization when it comes to language. Thank you.